At the Davenport family's sprawling home, the air was thick with excitement as friends and family gathered to celebrate the achievement of their only son, Jason. The large backyard was adorned with balloons and banners proclaiming, "Congratulations, Jason." The soft murmur of conversations blended with the clink of glasses and the hum of a nearby grill. It was the kind of party that had every element of a perfect celebration: laughter, smiles, and an overabundance of food. But in the midst of all this festivity, a storm was brewing, one that would unravel everything they had built. Alicia Davenport stood near the punch bowl, her eyes scanning the crowd. At first glance, she seemed like the proud mother, glowing in the spotlight of her son's success. But beneath the surface, the smile she wore was as fragile as glass. She had kept a secret for years, one that had begun to gnaw at her conscience, especially now, as her husband, Brian, stood by the grill, chatting with Jason's friends. He was the picture of the happy, successful husband, smiling and shaking hands. Alicia watched him from a distance, her mind drifting back to the days she had first noticed something was wrong. The late nights, the unexplained absences, and the subtle hints of a second life he'd been leading. The nagging suspicion had eventually become an undeniable truth. Alicia had followed him one day. Just once, just to confirm what she already knew. The secret location where he had been spending his time, an apartment in the city, tastefully furnished, clearly meant for one. It had been months since she discovered it, and though the affair had long since stopped being a whisper in her mind, the truth still felt like a shadow she couldn't outrun. Her heart tightened as her gaze flicked over to the back door, the one leading to the private study where she had seen him exit, once again late at night, after a phone call that had been cut short. This study, usually a haven for Brian to work on his passion projects, had never been so full of secrets. Jason approached his mother, interrupting her spiraling thoughts. "Mom, have you seen Dad? He said he had something to show me after the party," he asked, his eyes sparkling with the innocence of a boy who still believed his family was whole. Alicia forced a smile. "He's around. Go on and find him." Jason gave her a quick hug and headed off, leaving Alicia to stare down at her trembling hands. The moment was near. The revelation was going to come out sooner than she had planned. Alicia's pulse quickened when she saw Brian walk towards her, his face flushed from the sun and a few beers too many. His demeanor was casual, but his eyes avoided hers. That was all the confirmation she needed. "I was just thinking," Brian began, his voice slurring slightly, "that we could all get together soon, maybe head to the lake this summer." Alicia didn't respond at first. She just stared at him, her anger bubbling to the surface. She had held it in for far too long. The anger, the betrayal, the shame, everything had built up until it became unbearable. "Funny," she said, her voice cold and sharp. "Because I was just thinking about something too. How about I show everyone something?" Brian's brow furrowed in confusion. Before he could say anything, Alicia turned toward the backyard, where the guests were still mingling. Without a word, she walked inside the house, toward the room that held the key to Brian's lies. Brian followed her, calling her name, but Alicia didn't stop. She opened the door to the study, and for the first time, she didn't hesitate. She reached into the desk drawer and pulled out the old, crumpled key to the apartment. The very apartment where Brian had spent countless nights with someone else. She held it up, and the silence in the room fell like a heavy curtain. "Alicia, don't," Brian pleaded, his voice shaky now, his facade cracking. "It's not what you think." But she was beyond reasoning. "You lied to me. All this time, I believed in us." Her voice broke, but she steadied herself. "And now, I'm going to show everyone who you really are." With a final, defiant glance at Brian, Alicia turned to the doorway and walked back outside, her heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor. She didn't need to say anything else. The key in her hand spoke volumes, and as the guests noticed her, the tension in the air thickened. Their eyes followed her, curious. Alicia didn't hesitate as she made her way to Jason, still talking to his friends. The moment her son looked at her, she held up the key. "Mom?" Jason asked, his voice quivering. "Jason, your father has a secret." "I think it's time you knew about it," she said, her voice breaking at the end. Brian was only a few steps behind, but he was too late. The words had already begun to spread. Some of their closest friends turned to look at him with wide eyes, and whispers began to circulate. Jason stood still, his face pale, his eyes flickering between his parents. For the first time, he saw his mother not just as a protective figure, but as a woman who had been wronged and finally found her strength. "I didn't want you to find out like this," Brian said, trying to salvage the moment, but it was already over. The truth had been exposed, and there was no going back. By the time the last guests left, the air felt different. The laughter that once filled the house was replaced by heavy silence. Alicia, though shaken, felt a strange relief. Jason had his own questions now, but he was old enough to understand. The painful truth had been revealed, but in a way, it felt like the first step towards something new. For Alicia, the next chapter had begun. The days following the graduation party were filled with tension that Alicia could feel in every corner of the house. Jason had barely spoken to his father, his once hero now a shadow in his eyes. Brian had tried, unsuccessfully, to repair the rift, but Alicia was no longer willing to shield him from the truth. The lie that had festered for so long was out, and it was clear that things would never be the same. Alicia kept busy. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now seemed like a cage. Jason had spent more time out of the house, perhaps trying to avoid the growing chasm between his parents. Alicia understood. He wasn't ready to confront his father, not in the way she had, and she wasn't about to force him into it. Brian had tried to explain himself, to beg for forgiveness, but Alicia couldn't even look at him anymore without feeling the weight of his betrayal pressing down on her chest. Every time he spoke, it felt like another attempt to manipulate her, another lie waiting to slip out. He couldn't keep his promises, and now, in the quiet of their home, all the broken vows echoed louder than ever. It was late one evening, a week after the party, when Alicia found herself sitting at the kitchen table, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. She had been staring at the same glass of water for what felt like hours, lost in thought. The silence between her and Brian had become deafening, yet no one dared break it. Even Jason's rare visits home felt more like interruptions than moments of connection. A knock at the door broke her trance. Her first thought was that it was Jason returning, but when she opened the door, she was surprised to find one of their old friends, Lauren, standing there with a concerned look on her face. "Lauren?" Alicia said, surprised, but relieved to see a familiar face. "Is everything all right?" Lauren stepped in without waiting for an invitation, her gaze shifting to the hallway as if expecting someone else. "I need to talk to you," she said quietly. Alicia raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Lauren lowered her voice, looking over her shoulder. "It's about Brian." Alicia's heart skipped a beat. "What about him?" "I know this isn't easy, but you need to hear it," Lauren said, her eyes filled with hesitation. "I've been talking to some people. There's more to this story than just the affair." Alicia felt a cold chill run through her. "What do you mean? What more could there be?" Lauren bit her lip, as if debating how much to reveal. Finally, she spoke. "I found out that Brian's been involved in something illegal. It's not just about the affair. He's been laundering money through his business dealings. I didn't want to believe it at first, but the evidence is there. He's been hiding it for years." The room seemed to close in around Alicia. She felt as though the ground beneath her was shifting, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. She stared at Lauren, her mind racing. "Are you sure?" Alicia's voice trembled. "How do you know this?" Lauren exhaled sharply. "I found some documents in his office when I went to visit last week. I wasn't snooping," I just happened to be looking for a file I'd left behind. The things I saw, well, they explain a lot about how Brian's been able to live the way he has, the way he's always gotten away with everything." Alicia stood frozen, the weight of this new revelation crashing into her like a wave. Everything she thought she knew about her husband, the man she had married, the father of her child, was slipping away from her grasp. "How long has this been going on?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Years," Lauren replied. "I've been hearing rumors for a while, but I couldn't confirm anything until now." "Alicia, I'm sorry. I had to tell you." Alicia's head swirled. This was more than just an affair. Brian had been hiding a criminal life behind the mask of a respectable businessman, a father, a husband. And now, it seemed that the whole house of cards was falling apart. She stepped back, her hands shaking. "I need to think," she said, her voice distant. "I need to process this." Lauren hesitated, then nodded. "I'll be around if you need me." She turned and left, the sound of the door closing behind her leaving a finality in the air. Alicia stood alone in the kitchen, the weight of what she had just learned pressing down on her. She felt sick to her stomach. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. She needed to talk to Brian. But what would she even say? How could she face him after everything he had done? Later that night, when the house was still and Jason had retreated to his room, Alicia found Brian in the living room, watching TV. He looked up as she walked in, his face softening when he saw her. "Hey, Alicia," he said, his tone too casual, too rehearsed. "You all right?" She crossed the room, her movement slow, deliberate. She wasn't going to let him lie this time. She wasn't going to let him spin another story. "I know about the affair," she began, her voice low but steady. "But it's not just that, is it, Brian?" His face froze, his eyes widening in panic. "What are you talking about?" Alicia didn't flinch. She had no time for his denials now. "I know about the money. The laundering. All of it." His expression faltered, and for a brief moment, Alicia could see the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. "Alicia." Brian started, his voice strained. "I can explain," but she held up her hand, cutting him off. "No. You don't get to explain anymore. I've had enough. I don't know who you are anymore, Brian." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. She could see the realization sinking in, he was losing her for good this time. And yet, it didn't seem to matter to him. All he cared about now was damage control, saving whatever shred of his life he could. Alicia stood her ground. "I'm done. It's over." As she turned and walked toward the door, she heard him call after her, but she didn't look back. She couldn't. There was nothing left to save. The days after the confrontation felt like a strange limbo. The house was empty in a way that Alicia had never known it before, and it was as if she were walking through a house of ghosts. Brian stayed in his office most of the time, avoiding her, and when he did emerge, he was nothing but a shadow of the man he once was. He barely looked at her, and when he did, it was with a mixture of anger and guilt that made her skin crawl. Jason had, of course, heard about the breakdown in his parents' marriage, though Alicia had done her best to shield him from the harshest details. But as the days wore on, she could see the weight of the situation taking its toll on him. His silence spoke volumes. He didn't ask questions, he didn't want to know. It was late on a Friday night when Alicia received an unexpected call. She was sitting alone in the living room, a glass of wine in hand, trying to focus on the book in front of her, though her mind kept drifting. The phone rang, snapping her back to reality. She stared at the screen, surprised to see the name Lauren flashing up. With a sigh, she answered. "Lauren? What's going on?" "I think you need to meet me," Lauren said, her voice urgent. "There's something you should know. It's about Brian." Alicia sat up straight. What now? Is it worse than what you told me before? Yes, Lauren replied. Much worse. Meet me at the cafe near the park. I'll explain everything. The line went dead before Alicia could protest, and she was left staring at her phone, her heart pounding in her chest. What could Lauren possibly have to say now? Her mind was swirling with thoughts, each one darker than the last. But she knew that whatever Lauren had to tell her, she needed to hear it. Less than an hour later, Alicia found herself in a small cafe, sitting across from Lauren, who looked even more anxious than she had the last time they'd spoken. Lauren's eyes darted nervously around the room before she leaned in and lowered her voice. You need to trust me, Lauren said, her tone thick with unease. I've been digging into Brian's business dealings, really digging. And I found something that could ruin him. Alicia's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure whether she was prepared for whatever Lauren was about to reveal, but she didn't have a choice. She needed to know the truth. I found out about the illegal transactions, Lauren continued, her eyes flicking around again. But it's more than just that. Brian has been involved in some seriously dangerous people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. He's in way over his head, Alicia. And I think he's trying to cover his tracks before it's too late. Alicia sat back in her chair, the weight of Lauren's words sinking in. The world she thought she knew was unraveling at an alarming speed. The betrayal was one thing, but this was something entirely different. Brian wasn't just a man who had lied to her, he was a man who had placed them all in danger, and she had no idea how deep it went. How do you know all this? Alicia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lauren hesitated. I did some more digging. There's a network of shady investors involved with Brian's business. I found some names, some addresses. But the thing is, Alicia, these people aren't just business partners. They're dangerous. And if Brian's not careful, they'll come after him. And you. Alicia's stomach twisted at the thought. What do you mean? What are they going to do? Lauren shook her head, her face pale. I don't know, but I've been hearing things. People don't just disappear over nothing. Alicia, Brian's been lying to you about more than just the affair. He's in deeper than you could imagine. Alicia felt the room start to spin. The weight of the situation was suffocating. She could see the danger creeping closer, and she wasn't sure how much longer they could stay out of harm's way. We need to do something, Alicia said, her voice shaking. This can't go on. Lauren nodded. You need to get away, Alicia. Take Jason, get out of town for a while. Let things cool off before Brian's mess catches up to all of you. The thought of leaving everything behind, of walking away from her life, felt almost impossible. But what other choice did she have? Her entire world had been built on lies and deceit, and now it was all crashing down around her. The safety of her family, of her son, depended on her making a decision. A hard one. I'll take Jason and go, Alicia said, her voice steady now, the decision made. But we need to be careful. I can't trust Brian anymore. I need to know how deep this goes before I make any more moves. Lauren's eyes widened. Alicia, don't wait too long. You have to get out before things get worse. This is bigger than you think. Alicia stood up, her mind made up. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she couldn't stay in the same place, in the same town, pretending like nothing had changed. There was no going back now. The truth was out, and she was no longer the woman who would tolerate lies and deceit. She was someone different now, a mother, a survivor, and soon, a woman on the run. As Alicia stepped outside, the crisp air hit her face, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of clarity. Whatever happened next, she was going to protect her son. And she was going to do whatever it took to keep them safe from the web of lies her husband had spun. Alicia didn't sleep that night. She spent the hours pacing through the house, gathering her thoughts, planning her next steps. She knew she couldn't just leave in a hurry. Jason needed to understand, even if he didn't want to. The last thing she wanted was to put him in more danger by being reckless. As dawn crept in, Alicia found herself standing in the kitchen, the morning light creeping through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. She wasn't sure how to begin the conversation with Jason. He had been distant for days, his mind wrapped in confusion and hurt. She couldn't blame him, this had shattered his perception of everything. His father, the man he had always admired, had betrayed him just like he had betrayed her. But as Alicia stood there, she knew there was no way to protect him from the truth anymore. She couldn't keep running from it, and neither could Jason. Taking a deep breath, Alicia called up to Jason's room, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "Jason, can you come downstairs? We need to talk." It didn't take long before Jason appeared, his face drawn with exhaustion. He looked like a boy on the verge of growing up too fast. He still hadn't shaved, his hair messy from sleep, but his eyes, they were the eyes of a young man trying to process things no child should have to. "Mom." His voice was hesitant, unsure of what to expect. "Come sit," Alicia said, her voice soft. "I need to explain everything. I need you to understand what's been happening." Jason sat down at the kitchen table, his fingers tapping nervously against the wood. He didn't speak, but his gaze was intense, almost desperate to know the truth, even though he wasn't ready for it. Alicia sat across from him, her hands folded on the table. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about her son's future. She had to make him understand that they were both in danger, more than he could possibly comprehend. "I know you've been hearing things, Jason," Alicia began, her voice trembling slightly. "I know you've seen how things have changed between your father and me. But there's more to it than you realize." Jason looked at her, his brow furrowing, but he stayed silent. Alicia continued, gathering the courage to say the words that had been haunting her. "Your father has been lying to us. For years. He's been seeing someone else, but it's not just that. I found out something worse. He's been involved in illegal activities. He's been laundering money, hiding things from us. And there are people, dangerous people, who are after him. And now, they're after us." Jason's face went pale. His hands clenched into fists on the table, and Alicia could see the storm brewing in his eyes. The shock, the anger, the hurt, it was all there, a whirlwind of emotions. "What do you mean, Mom? What kind of people?" Jason's voice was tight, the words almost choking him. Is this why you and Dad?" Alicia interrupted him, her voice firm but gentle. "Yes, Jason. This is why. Your father didn't just cheat on me. He got involved with people who don't play by the rules. People who will do anything to protect their interests. And now we're caught in the middle of it." Jason swallowed hard, his expression a mix of disbelief and fear. "So what happens now?" Alicia took a deep breath. "We leave. We have to get away before things get worse. I've been in touch with some people who can help us, but we need to move fast. I don't know how deep this goes, but the sooner we leave, the safer we'll be." Jason stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His voice cracked as he turned to face her. "You want us to run? Like we're some kind of criminals too?" "No," Alicia said, standing up as well. She crossed the room to him, her hands reaching out to him, but he stepped back. "You're not a criminal, Jason. This isn't your fault. It's your father's. But we need to go. For your safety, for both of us. I can't keep pretending everything's okay when it's not." Jason ran a hand through his hair, frustration and confusion clouding his eyes. "How am I supposed to believe anything now? Everything's a lie. Dad, he broke off, his voice thick with emotion, as if he couldn't finish the thought. Alicia's heart clenched. She knew how hard this was for him. She wanted to shield him from the pain, but there was no way to protect him from this truth. She stepped closer to him, her voice soft but resolute. "I know this is hard," Alicia said, her voice breaking. "But we don't have a choice. We have to keep moving. If we don't, it could be worse. Please, Jason. For me, for you, we have to get out of here. This place, this life, it's not safe anymore." Jason's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't cry. He was trying to hold it together, to make sense of everything. But it was too much. And Alicia could see that. She could feel it. "Where will we go?" he asked quietly, his voice barely a whisper. Alicia took his hand in hers, squeezing it tightly. "I have a place in mind. It's out of town. We'll figure it out. But we need to leave soon. I don't want to drag this out any longer." Jason nodded slowly, still processing the enormity of what was happening. Alicia could tell he wasn't ready to accept it, but he understood enough. They had to go. "Okay," he said after a long pause, his voice tight with emotion. "Let's go." Alicia felt a rush of relief wash over her, but it was quickly replaced by fear. They were on the run now. There was no turning back. As she packed their things, she made a mental note of the most important things: documents, cash, whatever she could carry with them. She knew Brian would come looking for them eventually, but she wasn't going to let him destroy their lives any more than he already had. As the sun set, Alicia and Jason slipped out of the house, leaving behind a life they could never return to. They didn't know what lay ahead, but as they drove away from the only place they had ever known, Alicia promised herself one thing: she would do whatever it took to protect her son. And she wasn't going to let anyone, least of all Brian, stand in their way. The drive out of town was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the map on the dashboard. Alicia kept her eyes fixed on the road, the headlights cutting through the darkness as they made their way farther from the life they once knew. Jason sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, his face a mask of confusion and anger. He hadn't said much since they left the house, but Alicia could feel his tension in every inch of his still body. Alicia had no real destination in mind. The plan had been to get out, to put as much distance between them and the chaos of their former life as possible. She had called in a favor from an old friend, someone who owed her a debt, someone who had a cabin in the mountains. It wasn't much, but it was safe. And right now, that was all that mattered. The dark roads seemed endless, and Alicia couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them, closing in. Her mind raced with every shadow, every passing car. She couldn't let her guard down. Not now. Not when everything was so fragile. "Where are we going, Mom?" Jason's voice broke the silence, quiet and hesitant. Alicia's hands tightened on the wheel, her knuckles pale in the glow of the dashboard lights. She glanced over at him. "To a place where we can be safe. We just need time to figure things out." Jason didn't respond, but his eyes met hers, searching for something in her face. Answers, maybe. Comfort. But Alicia couldn't give him either. The truth was, she didn't have any answers. They were both running now, escaping from the fallout of Brian's life, and neither of them knew where it would lead. They drove through the night, the headlights of the car illuminating stretches of desolate highway. The quiet was suffocating, but neither of them seemed willing to break it. Alicia didn't know what to say to him. She didn't know how to explain to her son that their world had been destroyed by the man they had both trusted. By the man who was still out there somewhere, looking for them, his lies and his mess trailing in his wake. By dawn, they were well out of the city, the rolling hills of the countryside stretching out before them. Alicia felt a slight tension leave her shoulders as they passed the last sign marking the edge of town. They were far enough away now, at least for the moment. The cabin was small, tucked away in a grove of trees, its weathered wood blending into the forest around it. It wasn't much, but it would do. Alicia pulled the car up to the front and parked it near the porch. The cabin was dark, and she knew her friend wouldn't be there until later, but it was enough. They had a place to rest, at least for a few hours. Jason opened the door without a word and stepped out into the morning air, inhaling deeply as if he could breathe in the freedom of their escape. Alicia followed him, grabbing the bags from the back seat. She had packed light, just enough to get by for a few days. She wasn't sure how long they would need to stay here, but she didn't want to think that far ahead. Inside the cabin, it was quiet, empty. The walls were lined with old furniture, the scent of wood and dust hanging in the air. Alicia led Jason to a small room in the back, where a bed covered with an old quilt sat in the corner. She set down the bags and looked around. The place felt like a sanctuary, a temporary haven from the storm that had been their lives. Jason sank onto the bed, staring out the window, his mind clearly far away. Alicia sat beside him, her heart heavy with the weight of what they had left behind. "Do you think Dad's going to come looking for us?" Jason asked, his voice low, barely audible. Alicia didn't have an answer for him. She had no idea what Brian would do. He had already crossed so many lines, but this was different. They had taken everything from him now, his family, his life, his lies. Would he stop at nothing to find them? Would he go to the dangerous people Lauren had warned her about? "I don't know, Jason," she said quietly. "But we'll be ready for whatever comes. We're safe here, for now. And we'll stay that way as long as we need to." Jason nodded, but Alicia could see the uncertainty in his eyes. It was there, lurking just beneath the surface. How could she make him feel safe when she wasn't even sure of their safety herself? They spent the rest of the day inside the cabin, only venturing out briefly to gather some firewood. The isolation was both a relief and a burden. The stillness of it all gave Alicia a chance to breathe, but it also made her feel more exposed than ever. She knew that Brian had the resources to find them, and he wouldn't stop until he had reclaimed what he thought was his. As night fell, Alicia found herself sitting by the fire, the flickering light casting shadows on the walls. Jason had gone to bed hours ago, exhausted from the long drive. Alicia stayed awake, watching the flames dance in the hearth, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. She thought about Brian, about the lies and the betrayal. She thought about the danger he had brought into their lives, and she knew deep down that it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Brian would come for them, and when he did, they needed to be ready. The sound of the door creaking open broke her reverie, and Alicia turned to see Jason standing in the doorway, his face pale in the moonlight. "Mom," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know how to live like this." Alicia stood up and walked over to him, her heart aching for her son. She put a hand on his shoulder, guiding him back to the couch. "I know it's hard, Jason. It's hard for me too. But we'll get through this. You and me. Together." Jason looked at her, his eyes searching hers for reassurance. She offered him the only thing she could, her strength. She had to be strong for him, for both of them. She had to keep going, no matter what. "I'm scared," Jason whispered, his voice breaking. "What if Dad finds us? What if he hurts you?" Alicia's heart clenched at the vulnerability in his words. She pulled him into an embrace, holding him close. "I won't let anything happen to you. I promise. We're in this together, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." The fire crackled softly, its warmth surrounding them, and for a moment, Alicia allowed herself to believe in that promise. Whatever came next, she would fight with everything she had to protect her son. She would fight to keep their family intact, even if it meant facing down the dangers of Brian's past and everything that came with it. Days passed in the cabin, and the quiet stillness of their new life began to feel like both a comfort and a prison. Alicia woke early every morning, checking the perimeter of their secluded refuge, looking for signs of anyone who might have followed them. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Every noise in the woods outside made her tense. Every passing car on the distant road kept her on edge. Jason, however, seemed to settle into the rhythm of their temporary home more easily than she had expected. He spent time reading, trying to distract himself, but Alicia could see the storm of thoughts swirling behind his eyes. He was different, quieter. She knew he was struggling to accept the situation. His entire world had been flipped upside down in the span of a few days. His father, the man he had always looked up to, had turned out to be nothing but a lie. Now they were living in isolation, trying to hide from the very person who had once been their protector. That evening, after another long, silent dinner, Alicia noticed Jason staring out of the window, his expression distant. The weight of everything was beginning to show on his face. The tension between them had faded, but in its place was a quiet sorrow, an unspoken fear that seemed to hang between them like a thick fog. Alicia decided it was time to have a real conversation with him, to try to break through the silence. "Jason," she began softly, standing from the table and walking toward him. "We need to talk." He didn't turn around at first. His eyes were fixed on the dark woods beyond the cabin. "About what?" His voice was flat, the anger and frustration having dissipated into exhaustion. "About everything," she said. "I know you're scared, and I am too. But I need you to understand that we're not just running away from your father. We're trying to protect ourselves. This life we're living now, it's temporary, but it's necessary." Jason finally turned, his face pale and drawn, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. "I don't get it, Mom. I don't get how everything went from normal to this. How did he get so messed up?" Alicia took a deep breath. She knew this wasn't easy for him to process. It was hard enough for her to understand, let alone explain it to her son. But he deserved the truth. "Your father made choices, Jason. He chose to get involved with people and things that he knew weren't right. And he thought he could keep it all hidden from us, keep it hidden from me. But he couldn't. And now we're all paying the price." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "I never thought I'd have to explain this to you. I never thought you'd have to know the truth." Jason's eyes hardened, and his jaw clenched. "But we're still running, aren't we? You said we were safe here, but it doesn't feel like it. I keep thinking that any minute, someone's going to knock on that door, and it's going to be him, or them, and we'll have to run again. I don't want to live like this, Mom." Alicia felt the familiar ache in her chest, the ache of a mother who would give anything to take her child's pain away. She stepped closer to him, her heart heavy. "I don't want you to live like this either," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But right now, this is the only way we can be safe. I won't let anything happen to you, Jason. Not while I'm here. You're my priority. I will fight for you, no matter what." Jason looked at her, his eyes filled with doubt. "But how? How are we supposed to keep running forever?" "We won't have to run forever," Alicia said, shaking her head. "But we need to make sure that when the time comes, we're ready. For now, we stay hidden. We stay quiet. And we take things one step at a time." Jason swallowed hard, and for a moment, Alicia thought he might break down in front of her. But instead, he nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging with the weight of it all. "I don't know how to keep doing this," he whispered. "You don't have to do it alone," Alicia said, her voice soft but firm. "We'll do it together. Every step of the way." They sat in silence for a long while, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the hearth. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the only one they had. And it was all they could hold on to right now. That night, after Jason had gone to bed, Alicia sat alone by the fire, her thoughts swirling like the flames before her. She knew she couldn't keep running forever. But she wasn't ready to face Brian, not yet. Not when the full extent of his betrayal still loomed over her like a dark cloud. She needed to gather strength, to figure out what came next. But the truth was, no matter how much she tried to convince herself, she knew the day would come when Brian would find them. She wasn't sure how long they could stay hidden in this small cabin, far away from the life they had known. The reality of it sank in slowly. This wasn't just a temporary escape. This was their new life. And if she was going to protect Jason, she would need to face her fears head-on. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows on the walls, and Alicia's thoughts were interrupted by a distant sound, a faint noise coming from the direction of the woods. It was the sound of something snapping underfoot. A twig? Or was it something else? Her heart skipped a beat. She stood quickly, moving toward the window, peering out into the darkness. The trees stood still, their shadows blending with the night. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, something, was watching them. For a moment, she stood frozen, her pulse racing. Then, without thinking, she grabbed her phone and dialed Lauren's number. It rang twice before Lauren picked up. "Alicia? What's going on?" Lauren's voice was groggy, but concerned. "I think someone's out there," Alicia whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. "I heard something. I don't know if it's just my mind playing tricks on me, but I don't think it is." "Stay calm," Lauren said quickly. "Get inside, lock the doors. Do not go outside. I'll find out if anything's going on and call you back." Alicia hung up the phone and moved quickly to lock the door. She felt the weight of every decision she'd made up until now crashing down on her. No matter how far they ran, no matter how hidden they thought they were, it seemed like Brian's world was closing in around them. She sat down in the dark, waiting for the next move, for something, anything, that would help her protect her son from the danger that was closing in. The night seemed to stretch on forever. Alicia sat in the dimly lit cabin, her eyes darting to every shadow in the room, every rustle of wind against the windows. Her pulse hammered in her ears, a constant reminder of the danger that was still lurking outside. Jason was asleep, thankfully unaware of the tension hanging over them. But Alicia couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't as safe as she had hoped. The minutes passed like hours, the darkness pressing in. When the phone rang, Alicia nearly jumped out of her skin. It was Lauren. Alicia grabbed the phone with shaking hands. "Lauren? What's going on?" "Stay inside," Lauren's voice came through firmly. "I don't know how, but I've learned that Brian's people are close. I've heard whispers, they've been tracking you. They've got leads, and they're getting closer." Alicia's heart plummeted. "How close?" "Too close," Lauren replied. "You need to move. Now." Alicia felt her breath catch in her throat. There was no time for planning anymore. The life she had hoped to build here was already being shattered, and she was running out of options. She glanced toward the door, wondering if it was too late to make it out unseen. "Where should we go?" Alicia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll get you to a safer place," Lauren said. "There's an old cabin a few hours south of you. Not many people know about it. It'll buy you some time." Alicia stood up, her legs weak beneath her, but she knew she had no choice. They couldn't stay here. Not with the threat of Brian's world closing in on them. Not when their safety was no longer guaranteed. "All right," Alicia said, gripping the phone tightly. "We'll leave now." Without thinking twice, she grabbed the bags they'd packed earlier, stuffing whatever essentials she could find into them. Jason stirred from the bedroom, rubbing his eyes sleepily. "Mom?" he asked, his voice low and confused. "What's happening?" Alicia didn't have time to sugarcoat it. "Jason, we have to leave. Now. It's not safe here anymore." Jason stood up, his face pale but resolute. "What's going on? Who's after us?" "It's your father's mess," Alicia said, her voice strained. "We're going to be all right, but we have to move fast." She quickly ushered Jason toward the door, checking one last time to make sure everything was secure. They weren't going to get caught off guard this time. Alicia stepped outside first, the cold air hitting her face like a slap. The moon was barely visible through the dense trees surrounding them. The silence of the forest felt oppressive, a reminder of how vulnerable they were out here. "Stay close, Jason," Alicia said softly, her voice carrying a mix of warning and reassurance. They moved quickly, through the trees and down the path leading away from the cabin. Alicia kept her eyes peeled, every sound making her heart race. She was terrified that Brian's people might already be nearby, or worse, that Brian himself might be waiting for them. The woods felt endless as they walked, the crunch of twigs underfoot the only sound that kept Alicia grounded. Jason walked silently beside her, his face set in a grim expression. She couldn't imagine what was going through his head, what kind of fear he was carrying, but she knew it mirrored her own. As they neared the road, Alicia's heart leaped into her throat. There, parked on the side, was a dark car she didn't recognize. It was just a shadow in the night, but Alicia's instincts screamed danger. They couldn't risk being seen. Not now. She pulled Jason back, signaling for him to stay low. They crouched behind a small cluster of bushes, their bodies pressed close together as they watched the car from a distance. "Are they looking for us?" Jason whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Alicia replied, her mind racing. "But we're not taking any chances." The minutes stretched on, feeling like hours, until the car finally drove away, disappearing down the road in the opposite direction. Alicia let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. "We have to go now," she said, urgency in her voice. They moved quickly, crossing the road and climbing into the nearby trees on the other side. The terrain grew rougher as they moved further into the wilderness. Alicia's legs ached, but she didn't dare stop. Not until they were in the clear. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached the place where Lauren had told them to go, a secluded, forgotten cabin far off the main road. It was smaller than the one they had left behind, but it felt like a fortress in comparison. Alicia felt a small sliver of hope pierce through her exhaustion. She opened the door cautiously, peering inside. The cabin was simple, rustic, but clean. It was exactly what they needed. "We're safe for now," Alicia said, her voice shaking with relief. She closed the door behind them, locking it quickly. Jason sank onto a nearby chair, still silent. Alicia stood by the window, peering through the small crack in the curtains. The road was far off, and there was no sign of anyone following them, but the nagging feeling of being hunted remained. Alicia knew that they couldn't stay here long. They needed to lay low, find some way to disappear completely. But for now, at least, they had time. Time to breathe, to regroup, and to plan what came next. The phone rang again, shattering the silence. Alicia's heart skipped a beat as she picked it up. It was Lauren. "Are you okay?" Lauren's voice came through, sounding more urgent than before. "We're here," Alicia said, her voice hoarse. "We made it to the cabin. But I don't know how long we'll be safe here." "I don't know either," Lauren admitted. "But this won't last forever. They'll keep looking for you. Brian's not going to stop. You have to keep moving, Alicia. Stay one step ahead." Alicia's chest tightened. She wasn't ready for the next fight. But she didn't have a choice. "Thank you for helping us," Alicia said softly, her voice thick with gratitude. "Don't thank me yet," Lauren said. "You'll need more than just a safe place. You'll need a plan." Alicia hung up, staring at the phone in her hand. She didn't have a plan, at least, not a good one. But she knew one thing for sure, no matter what happened next, she wasn't going to let Brian take away her son. She'd fight with everything she had left to keep them safe. As the fire in the cabin crackled softly, Alicia wrapped her arms around herself, her mind racing with the endless possibilities of what could come next. She couldn't run forever, but she would keep fighting. For Jason. For herself. And for the hope that someday, somehow, they would be free of the nightmare that Brian had created.